Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. With the return of shrinking to our screens, we welcome Season 1 cinematographer Jim Frohna. Jim will talk us through shooting the show and the creative choices he made to capture the heartfelt and comedic moments. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Jim. Hi Jim, thank you for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here, Rob. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time. We're here to talk about one of the new shows on Apple TV Plus, Shrinking, which I'm excited to talk about and have been sort of like devouring it week by week. I think Fridays is always Shrinking Day when they release it. Great, more than 30-minute episodes to sort of just relax the evening on a Friday before getting ready for the weekend.
That sounds nice.
I usually like to start from the beginning, but I think in this case, I'm going to steer away from it. How have you found the response to the show?
You know, it's actually been really lovely, the response that the show's been getting, both in terms of people in the industry that I know who are watching and catch my name before the credits get zapped off the screen, and, you know, reaching out and sharing their feelings about the show. And similarly, you know, my family members are having people who recognize my last name and say, "Oh, we've been watching this great new show and we saw, are you related to Jim Frohna?" and all that kind of thing. And that just tells me that a lot of people are watching and connecting with it. And I'm not totally surprised, given, you know, who the creators are, that it's, you know, many of the same folks from Ted Lasso. And like that show, this thing balances a lot of humor with a lot of honest pathos and pain and, you know, real story of people dealing with grief. So it's a nice combination. So I'm very pleased by the response, but I'm not surprised.
With people like saying, "Are you related to this Jim Frohna guy?" That's always something that. But you've basically made it now. If friends or family are asking,
I guess I mentioned that I share that because that doesn't happen with every show. You know, so
yeah. No, I know what you meant. I just sort of wanted to sort of play it off as a sort of more of a funny thing, though. And I guess,
Sure.
and it shows the sort of wider audience that the show has. So how did this project come about for you?
Well, as I mentioned, you know, the Ted Lasso part of it, as soon as I had heard, you know, I check in with my agents every now and then and to find out about upcoming projects. And, you know, as I'm midway or ending one of the project I'm on, I want to know what's, you know, coming out or coming up. And my agent mentioned Jason Segel and Brett Goldstein and Bill Lawrence as the creators. And basically I said, I don't know any of those people. I don't have connections, you know, through my previous work, but please get me a meeting. And because I, like many people, I love Ted Lasso. It basically gave me and my family a ton of hope and joy during, you know, the darkest days of the pandemic. And so I, you know, without even reading the script, I was like, I got to find a way to at least get a Zoom with these guys and see, you know, where things could go from there. And obviously it went very well because I got hired as the DP for the whole season.
When you have those first meetings and initial talks with the creators, what's discussed, and do you pitch yourself and your work, or is it just getting a sort of mood and feel of what they want with the show and how it's going to look?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely varies. I think the first meeting is generally just people checking each other out, like, what is the energy I'm getting from this person, and does it seem like somebody I would want to work with? And on that first call, James Ponsel was also there, who is one of the producers and also directed the pilot and 3 or 4 of the episodes. And so, you know, typically as a DP, I'll get a script to read, right? So then I can go into it having and obviously if I'm taking the meeting, that means I have had some response to the material as well. So, and presumably they, you know, have gotten my resume or they're aware of some of my work. So we don't really talk about that so much. It's more like, you know, what did I think of the script and what did I respond to most? And I always keep things, it's not like you're digging that deep into, I'm not pitching them on how I would shoot it. I tend to go off the emotional response. So I'll just talk about scenes that really struck me or moved me, and, coming from this kind of feeling place as opposed to, any kind of creative discussion. And I also do my homework. I find out a bit about the people who are going to be on the call, and I can, sometimes depending on the timing of things, if I'm not already on a gig, I can look up some of their work. So I don't necessarily even reference it in the meeting, but it helps me understand who they are and where they're coming from historically, which might give me some insight into, what they're aiming to do with the current or the new project in front of us.
Yeah, I guess when you're doing research on creators and seeing what sort of look and feel they've had in previous shows, you can kind of, as you said, gauge an idea of what's kind of expected of you, or the sort of vibe, as you said, like the sort of vibe that you get off people and what they would like to do with a project.
Yeah, and for example, in this case, Bill Lawrence, although he was actually not on that first call, but his lieutenant producer was. But I actually listened to a podcast that Bill Lawrence was on, and he talked about how he has a no asshole policy, and that's something that for a while now in my career, it's like I love what I do. I love being on a set. I love working with crew. I love the energy. We're all the oddballs and misfits and everything. But one thing I can't stand is people who are assholes, and I won't hire them on my crew. Everybody has to be a human being first and can also do a good job, but there's no reason to be cruel, mean, bitter, whatever. And so that was something that I was really glad to hear Bill Lawrence talk about, because then I was like, okay, well, this already gives me a sense of like, I'm probably going to really like working with these people if this is how, the head honcho sets the tone for the whole thing. So that was something that I learned in my research before getting on the first Zoom for Shrinking.
I think it's a good policy to live by, especially when you're working with people that basically effectively become a second family, and you're going to be around each other for so long. So it's always, I think, as the slogan is for Ted Lasso, is like that sort of believe and be kind to one another.
Yes. Yeah.
With the visual language of the show, it's quite, for its subject matter, it's a show that's quite bright and uses a lot of colour, effectively giving that hope feeling. How did you go about creating that visual language, and why did you steer away from making the show kind of look a bit dour and dreary due to the subject matter?
Well, so when I first got hired and started having conversations with James Ponsell, the director of the pilot, as I mentioned, we talked a lot about that the tone of the show swings all over the place, right? It goes from broad physical comedy to moments of real honest emotion and pathos and real grief and pain for this family and for this character, Jimmy, and his daughter particularly. And so we talked about, both of us came to the same kind of instinctive response, which was to try and give this thing a grounded feeling, to have the lighting and just the nature of how we film it to be grounded in, quote unquote reality, and that it doesn't want to have a sheen to it, or, we're not going for a sitcom look or sitcom colors. And, the thing that kind of popped into my head early on was this idea that everything can be a little rough around the edges, or like Jimmy, particularly in the very beginning, is not doing well. And so this idea of like that his life is sort of off kilter or a mess, or I use the word rumpled, but that sounds a little limiting. But it was basically like things are not perfect, but there's hope within it. But what's interesting, I will tell you, is that I went for a lot of shadow, and I went for a lot of, not tons, because it's not, a heavy dramatic series, but there is contrast, and I think it depends on maybe one's TV or screen that one's looking at. But the other thing that I will say that happens with shows these days is that all of the streamers want things 4K and HDR, and so even when I might have lit a scene in a more moody way, I end up watching it at my TV at home, and I think the show still looks great. I'm still very, very pleased. But it is interesting to note that it's almost like no matter what you do, once they get it through, they put it through the 4K and HDR process after coloring, and everything's a little crisper, everything's a little brighter. So I did my work, to give it a mood and a feeling. And I think it's still in there. And then it just gets a little juiced up from the HDR finish.
So in this sort of case, do you get involved in that HDR 4K process, or is that something that the streamers and post-production team just sort of keep an eye on and sort out?
Well, I am involved. I mean, it's interesting. Over the last few years, it's gone from, you finish in standard def or standard DR. I shouldn't call it def, but, and then they're going to do an HDR pass. And that was probably 5 years ago. And then as, TVs have gotten more advanced and in other words, there was a time when even when they had the capability of finishing in HDR, not a lot of TVs or other things were set up to receive that signal. So, but then things have advanced and now you're pretty much coloring in HDR. But the irony or the kind of weird thing is the conundrum is that I'm not looking at it in HDR when I'm working with a colorist. And this is not true for necessarily every show. And as it turns out, on doing the coloring on Shrinking, I was actually on a feature film in Atlanta. So I was actually looking at an iPad and then sending my notes to the colorist. Whereas, typically back in 4 years ago, in the old days, you'd be in the room with the person. Now you can do coloring remotely, live where there's no signal loss. But so I was doing it on an iPad. So consequently, I'm not seeing what the end result is going to be. I'm shaping it and worked with this colorist for over a decade. I trust her implicitly. So I know that she's going to do the HDR pass, but I'm not actually seeing that as we're going through the episodes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the sort of not being there. You're not sort of overseeing it completely, instead of seeing it in the edit suite where you'll have your 4K monitors and sort of the best gear available. I think that's quite interesting though to hear, is that sort of process after shooting where you're working with a colorist and what's like the next sort of process of like what happens to the image once it's been edited and once it's been captured and edited and it's getting ready if it's fine for the final product. Because working with, so you mentioned you worked with the same colorist for 10 years, so you have a relationship where you're sort of just trust their process and they'll take on board what you'll say as well, or you'll take on board what they say. But when you're in that process as well, what is the process of talking to a colorist and getting them to sort of tweak your work and to make it look like the best it can possibly look?
Well, so I mean, you can tell me if I'm getting too specific or for your question, but basically I will, and I'll speak to just generally what the process is, but then also if you're interested, I can speak to the specifics of what I did remotely on Shrinking. And maybe I'll start there because that was unique, right? Where Corinne Bogdanovich is the colorist name. She works at a really great company called Light Iron out here in LA, Hollywood. And so Corinne has done 95% of the shows I've shot since 2013. And so she gets me. I understand her in a way. And even if a couple of years have gone by between projects, it's really nice to have that history together and to fall back into a pretty quick shorthand. The situation with Shrinking was I was doing an Amazon feature in Atlanta. And so because of the time difference plus my busy schedule, I was not able to do even a remote session where you're live, where you're conferring with the colorist while you're both looking at a screen with the same image. And as she makes changes, I can see them. That is how things have evolved, particularly since COVID hit. But in this case, I will look at an episode and, there's note taking within the, app or whatever I'm using so that it's marked along the time code bar, like where I make a comment. So, I can hit pause and type in, oh, please make the wall behind Harrison Ford's head darker. Take it down a little bit so our eyes drawn a little bit more to him. So it's nice to have, you're doing a lot of that, right? You're doing a lot of little finesses. Maybe a character's eyes are a little bit darker than you wanted them on the day. So then the note is, just lift up the eye sockets a little bit. And in a bigger, broader sense, I'm basically I shot it with certain lenses and a certain feeling. And then, like I said, when you do go into the HDR of it, things are already altered. So Corinne's first big task is how to get the HDR version to look as close as what my intentions were. And so we had a little back and forth about that, because everything gets a little bit more contrasty and everything gets a little poppier color wise and all that with HDR. And so my approach is always to try and keep the flaws, keep the cinematic characteristics, the interesting little nuances of lenses. And a lot of that stuff can get kind of removed in the HDR as applied. So it's for one, just as a little side note, it's a reminder to me, like, in a way you can't go far enough on the day on the set in terms of going for your look, because knowing that a lot of it is going to be kind of counterbalanced or removed, we'll say, by the HDR of it. But back to shrinking and this, process of giving notes via the iPad. So once Corinne worked hard to get the HDR to look as close to my original intention, and the dailies to look at more as much like the dailies as possible, then it was just about maintaining that feeling across episodes, and also a couple cameras. Like, we always had two cameras going, that oftentimes there's just little subtle differences in the cameras themselves. So then her job is to just kind of make sure that from one angle to the next, everything's matching. And where I really had to kind of put my trust in her was that there were a lot of things, like the visual effects in certain episodes were not done when I was doing my coloring of the episodes on the calendar, where this was my time slot to like go through these 3 episodes this week, 3 episodes next week. So some stuff was not done, and I just had to say, okay, I know she gets the look of the show now, and it's in her hands to, once they finish all the VFX stuff, to bring it all together, unify the whole look.
When you're mentioning about adding, it's just basically sort of adding those nuances of not being able to capture things on the day. Like, as you said, if there's bits where it's just a tad bit too dark on somebody's eyelid and uplifting in that area, or it's like putting icing on a cake, effectively. Right. I think that's the sort of easiest way to use an analogy on it. And I do like that sort of idea of you have what you've got captured, and then having those nuances sprinkled in to improve what you've created.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's the way to put it.
I was going to sort of go back to the shooting process with my next question, because with shrinking, a lot of it looks like quite naturalistic with the California sunlight. How do you go about creating that look? Do you rely quite a lot on natural light from the sun, or would it be a case of setting up your lights to have that look?
I mean, I love natural light. For a while now, that's one of the things I'm known for, and I think what people sometimes will hire me for, in terms of just like a naturalism to both the feeling of what the camera's doing, but particularly the lighting. And it's something that I take pride in, that some of my cinematographer friends will text me and say, wait a minute, that Jimmy's office on Shrinking is a set. Nice work. And so I am pleased to say that, like, Jimmy's house on Shrinking and the office where the therapists all work, those are sets on stage. But so a big part of what I do in prep with my gaffer and key grip is we just talk about, where is the sun? Where is it coming in? We try and set up a truth, right? Where it's like, well, if this is where the building actually is, if this were a real building and you couldn't change where the sun rises and falls, then where's our sun? And then we kind of commit to that. And it's fun to do. It's one of the things that amazes me about what we do in the movie and TV business is all of the ways that you can take something that's fake and make it look very, very real. And it's a fun thing for me it's a fun challenge to kind of bring that natural light. And yes, and to your point, by the way, James Ponsolt, one of the EPs and the director of the pilot, said, we talked about like that, if there's going to be sun on Jimmy at home, it's going to be very harsh, because he's basically a vampire living, at night and partying and all that, and then barely able to kind of deal with the harsh light of day. And then in the office, it was, my intention going into the show was, let's start Jimmy's office where it's always open shade. There's no direct sunlight. Like he doesn't get the plants in his office were actually meant to be you don't really notice them in the frames, but they're like all feeble and drying up and dying. And then as the season goes on, the set deck people switched out the plants for, as Jimmy kind of figures himself out, the plants get healthier. So I went with this idea of, let's have it where, there's not direct sunlight. It's just, there's tons of window light, but so it's not like he's in a black hole. But anyway, I'm not sure how much of that translated, because I think after like 2 episodes, we're like, well, we can't just have the same look every time we're in Jimmy's office. So we started introducing the sun, like coming in the background behind him, but it doesn't necessarily hit him and that kind of thing. And, those things are fun to kind of use as the springboard for how you approach the look and lighting of a show. I don't know if they ever translate to the viewers, but those are some of the things that we went for.
I think it does translate. I think there's something that you notice massively in the show. And I do like that naturalistic look, because it doesn't deter away from what you're seeing on screen. So you kind of feel more as an audience member, you're kind of like a fly in the wall on the conversations that the patients are having and what's happening on screen. And I quite like that feeling. And also it makes, because it's we're sort of at the tail end of winter now, having that show where it is bright and feels warm also sort of makes you feel like more upbeat, because you're seeing the sun, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I quite like the look on that show, and also that sort of feeling as well, because it does have that juxtaposition of what you're seeing on screen is quite sad, but there is a lot of hope still out there to sort of pull through, especially with the lighting and looking of the show. You mentioned as well that the sort of like the office and other sets, but when you have a show where it looks like it is a mixture between locations and sets, how do you go about match cutting between the two areas so that when it comes to the editing process and people watching the show, that it kind of looks seamless?
What first popped to mind in terms of the mix of, going from a location to then on set is Jimmy's house, right? Because there's a lot of stuff out on the driveway in his front yard throughout the episodes. And there are a few occasions when you'll see him, heading up the front step, and then you cut as he's coming inside and now you're on stage. And that is definitely, a tricky thing, right? Because sometimes you're shooting on set first before you do the location, and you don't, let's say, it's typically sunny in Pasadena, California, so that's what we're going with on the stage. But then when you end up getting to the location and it's, overcast, cloudy day, for example, we actually didn't, there was one time when we had that scenario, but I'm using that as an example to say, like, sometimes you don't know when you're shooting out of order, and so you kind of just take a chance. But in the case of Jimmy's house, and my example here, we were lucky because the style of home that Jimmy has, which is Craftsman, it has a big overhanging awning over the front porch. So automatically, there's not a lot of direct sunlight that gets into those homes. It does early in the morning or, end of day. But so you could pretty much, hedge your bets that doing a soft daylight push as opposed to hard rays of sun means that when you're on the stage set means you're in the right ballpark in terms of like how to help that transition from a real place outside to the set inside. And but it also is something where that's where the coloring process helps out. I'm thinking of a very small moment early on in the pilot where Jimmy is alone in the house, as he often is, and he hears, or there's car headlights that kind of take him out of a memory, and then he walks over to a window and looks out, and what you see out the window is, or from his POV, is the neighbor woman Liz and Jimmy's daughter Alice getting out of the car and walking up and just chit-chatting as they go into Liz's house. And that was something where in coloring, I was able to match because when we shot, again, we did shoot that out of order. So when we shot Jimmy looking out the window on stage, it felt like middle of the day. And then by the time we got to shoot Alice and Liz getting out of the car, it was very close to night. It was very dusky, and the neighbors and the real yard has big trees. So it was even a little bit dimmer in terms of the daylight where they were getting out. And so it's not a big challenge to do it, but you press a couple buttons or turn a couple knobs, and Corinne in the coloring was able to bring down Jimmy in the house enough so that it's a pretty good match. I notice it. I don't think many people would, but basically it's like that. That's another example of what you contend with when you're mixing locations with stage sets.
Okay, because I think that's always an interesting sort of challenge for someone with the match cutting and the going from a location to set, and also the fact that a lot of shows aren't shot in order. So you'd have, due to availability, or one day you'd be somewhere else, and then the next you'll be sort of matching onto that same scene, but on set.
Right. Yes.
And I think it's also, there must be so much sort of meticulous planning to say, okay, if the lighting is like this on location, then we need to find a light equivalent to match that on set,
right.
Which would be quite fascinating to find out as well, the sort of idea of going through your camera tests and light tests to find out what would be perfect before everything's rigged up.
Right. Well, yes, there's definitely like the thinking and the planning and the hoping and the experience that guides you towards making smart choices, hopefully, usually. But then there's also the reality of production, right? Where it's like, oh, this scene was supposed to be filmed as if it was, the end of day and, kind of low sun in the sky and magic hour, the feeling almost of magic hour. Well, with the way things worked out and location availability, it's noon. It's the middle of the day and the sun does not have the feeling that you want. And that is part of just the reality of production, right? Where you just have to, this is the day, this is the time of day we have this location. Or, sometimes you can push one way or the other, but sometimes things are beyond your control, where it's like, we only have this soccer field that you see Alice playing in a couple episodes, and we only have this, we can only be here between 11 a.m. and 3, because otherwise there's soccer leagues, football, people playing using the field, that those schedules can't be changed, so we have to squeeze in in a narrow window. So oftentimes it's just, even if you have a great plan for something else, you just have to kind of embrace what is and do your damnedest.
Yeah, and especially when you're on such a tight time limit, so you kind of want to get on with what you need to do and get the best end result. There's another question that I'm curious to find the answer out about, and that's working with, when you're working with people who are so close with a project. So, for example, Jason Segel, who's listed as a creator exec and is acting in it. Are there any sort of late minute changes or sort of improv whilst on set where, because they're so heavily involved in that creative process, that you sort of have to change what you've planned in prep?
In the case of Shrinking, there was a good amount of improvisation, particularly in scenes with Jason Segel, as you mentioned. Yes, he's was not only one of the co-creators and producers, but also wrote on a couple episodes, and but he's also extremely funny and has a very quick wit and is very skilled at improvising, as is Jessica Williams, who plays Gabby, one of the other therapists. And actually, they kind of started doing these in improvs in scenes with Harrison Ford as their mentor therapist, and it was quite thrilling to see Harrison just kind of roll along with it, especially because you don't think of you can see through his movie persona and different characters, like he definitely has wit and humor, but he's doing something slightly different here. And it was pretty amazing and fun to watch how they could just start bantering and the funny things that they would come up with on the fly. But to answer your question about how that affected me or the production process, it didn't really, because it would always happen within a scene. There was still the point of the scene, why they're all gathered in the break room having this conversation, and so it's just within that scene. That's where the improvisation would happen. But there was a lot of what's great. One thing that I really appreciate and respect about actually all of them, but specifically you asked about Jason, that he, despite his role and is doing triple duty, and also he was in almost every scene, so he had a lot to do every day on set, and yet he was always very, very open and warm, and he's a very open-hearted guy, and that sort of inspired a certain energy on the set too, that kept things connected, and it wasn't, I don't want to say light, but it was like you enjoyed the process. The process was there to be enjoyed, and I think it was a lot of fun for the other actors to join in those improvs, and to realize that could be part of the language and part of the music that was made on the set each day.
Yeah, because I think it's an interesting point that you made, that Jason is in pretty much every scene. So that must be quite a lot to sort of get into character, but also create that frame of character as well. But when you're mentioning improv, is that something that happens when the cameras are rolling, or do you guys block the scene with the improv and then the camera sort of, not necessarily guided, but is taken, the actors take the lead of like what the camera does?
I mean, most of the things that are coming into mind, I've been in that situation where actors are on a different show where the actors were very free to move about a space that they were in, or to try different things, or they're sitting this time and they were standing last time, or when they rehearsed this line they were doing something different, and in those cases it was very alive, and you really had to be paying attention as a camera operator to know that anything was possible, right? So maybe a character's going to walk down the hallway out of the room that you're in. That's a fairly extreme example, but I've been in that situation, and it's fantastic. I love it. I think that show was called Transparent, and there was something inherent in the DNA of that show that was meant to feel like you really are a fly on the wall. You really are witnessing this family and all the things going on, and the energy of the cameras was a part of that, right? To not know what might come next. And not that it's like manic or antic craziness, but just like that it's a living, breathing thing unfolding before your eyes. It was really the ethos of that show. By contrast, the improv I'm talking about here on Shrinking was just more in dialogue and not even in the blocking. So a lot of it did happen on camera when the cameras were rolling. And, there would be times when Jason would just try something, or, and then Jessica Williams actually comes from improv comedy. That's in her background. So she was ready to, roll at any second, whatever, Jason would throw out. And then oftentimes Bill Lawrence would be on set, or, whoever the writer producer was on set. And then, they would respond to something that Jason did, for example, and then they'd throw an alternate line. So in that way, it is happening on camera, and they're trying different things. And, but it was much more contained in terms of the frame's already set. The blocking's already set. Now they're just kind of riffing in terms of dialogue changes.
With like a comedic shows, I'm always curious to know about the improv and how that affects crew around, if it doesn't sort of not ruin, but sort of if they need to make changes to how they've set up.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that there's so much, I guess it's like there's so much that can happen on the day, where sometimes it's not necessarily strict to what's written on the paper, but what people would feel that their character would do in that moment.
Yeah.
We've got a few last questions for you. What was your favourite scene to shoot on the show?
Let's see. Well, we're in terms of what people may have seen, we're coming up on halfway or just over halfway through the season, right? There is a storyline involving the Harrison Ford character and his adult daughter, Meg. They are very distant. He's been estranged from the family. And it's about, so there's, without telling you everything that is going to happen in it, he's kind of stumbling towards reconnecting with her in his own way. And it's slow and it's not easy, but he's trying to reconnect with her. And I'm leaving out other aspects of it just because I don't know what people have seen or not, but because I don't want to spoil it. But those scenes between Harrison Ford and the actress Lily Rabe, who plays his daughter Meg, were really wonderful. And I love comedy and I laughed a lot, a tremendous amount almost every day on the show. But the scenes that were kind of the more tender, intimate scenes always really struck me and resonated with me. And the aspect of, and we haven't even talked about how amazing it was to work with Harrison Ford. And I signed on to the show. I got hired before he was actually even cast, before they knew who was going to play that role. And, it was obviously a very big, huge, exciting thing to find out that he was going to be part of it. And he's a fantastic human and just really respects the whole crew and is just a cool dude and a very real person. He's just like, he's lived his whole life on a movie set and that's where he's comfortable. And he loves just chatting with the dolly grip or hanging out with the moon people or, chatting with the makeup crew. But anyway, so the scenes, and of course there's something, I always get a little, tug on the heart when it's like a father-child story, in this case, father-daughter, and seeing not only that it's Harrison Ford playing these scenes, but also just they're very well written, this dynamic. And I suppose he reminds me a bit of, he's the same age as my dad, who passed away a couple of years ago. And I'm sure that had to do with why I was touched by these scenes too. But yeah, just seeing, because he, in the world of the show, he's a very hard, like he wears a lot of armor, right? And he's got a lot of walls up. And then, so you kind of see through this relationship, the more vulnerable side of him. And that was pretty cool.
Harrison Ford does come off as somebody who does have a lot of armor up. I guess once it's down, I can imagine him being a really fun and funny guy. I think the best example is an interview that he did for the new Blade Runner here in the UK with a British presenter, and you could see that they had a lot of fun. If you have a chance, go watch it. I'll try send it to you later on.
Okay, yeah.
You'll have a good chuckle from it. But I guess when you're working with such talent as well, because he is a sort of figurehead from my childhood, I think at one point everybody wanted to be Harrison Ford because effortlessly cool. He's Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and to name some. But when you're talking about some of these scenes and capturing it, because as you said, you have those comedy. It's a comedy show, but with those dramatic elements. What's it like being present, being like being present in those scenes and being the first to see these performances and seeing what's being created in front of you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a very fortunate career in terms of working with some very, very talented people, and like Meryl Streep and Nicole Kidman and that kind of thing. And to be in the room when people of a certain caliber are performing, and sometimes it doesn't even matter that if they've been, they're like big, heavy duty actors, like it can also be somebody new and young. But I guess my point is that there are certain things where it takes your breath away to witness certain moments where people are where there's such a truth coming through in their performance, and a humanity. And so when you got to see, Harrison Ford playing vulnerable and scared because of his character's medical condition, and struggling to reach out to a family member who loves him, but he's afraid. Like seeing all that kind of wash over Harrison's face as we're filming is pretty impactful and again was very moving in the moment. And my thing that I've learned in my 20 years of doing this now as a DP is that if you feel it on the set, the audience is going to feel it. Like it's pretty much guaranteed. Like that chill you're getting watching through the camera is something that's going to, like that thing's going to just shoot through, all the way till the episode's cut and into the audience's heart as they're watching it.
I think having that opportunity to be the first to see what you're being captured as well, knowing that's like, people have no idea what's coming and they're going to get blown away by these scenes. Just to lead on to my final question, what's next for you?
So what's next? It's hard to say. I mean, I went immediately from Shrinking, as I mentioned, I went to Atlanta and did a feature, and I had not done a feature in probably 7 years or so. So I've got my, agents hunting for, there's such good stuff in TV these days, but I also have a hankering for features. So, it'll kind of depend on what comes up, but I definitely came back from Atlanta saying like, ooh, that was a lot of fun. I would love to do another feature film. But I'm fortunate, like I mentioned earlier too, that, I can take a little time off and I don't have to rush into the next thing. I've had some scripts come along or people inquiring about my availability and they've been fine projects, but I'm again fortunate that I'm able to just step back and say what's going to be a really great thing to get involved in. And that hasn't appeared as of, today, maybe tomorrow.
Yeah, I think having that time to be picky and let things breathe and have a look at what you want to do next is always extremely important.
And I was away from my family for a lot of last year, so it's been very important for me to reconnect with them and just be home, cooking meals, walking a dog and being a father.
Yeah, and watching Shrinking with them.
Yes, exactly.
No, Jim, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you coming on and speaking about Shrinking, which is streaming now on Apple TV+, and I would highly recommend people go out and seek the show. It is just something that, even if it's half an hour of your day to watch an episode, it is something that will put a smile on your face and give you some joy.
Yes, I agree. Well put.
Thank you. Thank you again, Jim. You take care and bye-bye.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.